I think right now we have a food access problem, a very serious food access problem. If the things get worse, then we will be in a very bad situation.
Yes, inflation is pushing up prices for just about everything, but rising food prices could mean life or death for millions of people out there in the world.
Just to give you an idea of the magnitude, on the 61 most vulnerable countries in the world, we are talking of an increase in the food import bill that is around $25.4 billion. So that's the additional cost to import the same amount of food for these 61 countries that they imported in the previous year. And this is touching 1.7 billion people. My name is Maximo Torero Cullen. I am the chief economist of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. My work at FAO is essentially to manage all the economic and socioeconomic information and to work intensively on analyzing the situation of food security in the world.
So we've been hearing for several months now about how the war in Ukraine is affecting food supply in some parts of the world and inputs, fertilizer being the big one. But what are the other factors at play in terms of this looming food crisis, do you think?
Look, the drivers behind the problems that we are facing in terms of food prices are conflict. Most of the countries in food crisis have conflict, internal conflict. The second is slowdowns and downturns, which in the case of COVID-19 was one of the major consequences, that the most poor countries are facing significant challenges in terms of slowdowns and downturns. And the third, of course, is climate change. Now, the war in Ukraine has exacerbated the situation that was already had started before the war in Ukraine. What I mean is that the prices of food were already increasing before the war, but the war in Ukraine, what did is stop exports from two key exporters of cereals in the world. Ukraine and Russian Federation are responsible of 30% of cereals in the world, and therefore they play a significant role in terms of availability of cereals. Their share is 30%, and around 50 countries depend on 30% of their imports on these countries, and of those 50, around 20 depend more than 50%. Wow. But the other additional factor which makes it extremely important in the case of the Russian Federation is that Russian Federation is one of the top exporters, the first exporter in the world of nitrogen, the second of potassium, and the third of phosphorus fertilizer. So Russian Federation decided to stop the exports of fertilizers to the world, and that has created also a significant problem, which has exacerbated even more the prices of fertilizers, which were already high before the war, and that creates a significant problem of affordability for farmers, which affects, of course, the next planting season.
Yeah, and sub-Saharan Africa is one of the regions being hardest hit because of its dependence on imports from Ukraine, especially, and with food making up for almost 40% of the consumption basket there. To what extent are other regions feeling the effects of these disruptions caused by the war?
So it's important to understand that when the war started, the gap of exports of wheat in the world were 8 million metric tons from the case of Russian Federation, and there were 6 million metric tons from Ukraine, so in total 14 million metric tons. And in the case of maize, the gap from Ukraine was 24 million metric tons, and from Russia Federation 2.5 million metric tons. Today, the gap is 3 million metric tons because of the supply response of some countries in wheat, and 8 million metric tons only in maize. So the gap today for this planting season, for this year, 2021-2022, is not so big. Now, what countries are affected? The key net food importers in the case of Africa were Northern African countries. Those are countries which depend substantially more than 50% of imports of wheat from these two countries. Sub-Saharan Africa is a little bit different. Sub-Saharan Africa is a continent that doesn't have wheat as a major staple, and they have cassava, rice, and what matters to them a lot is oilseeds. And sunflower is a key export of these two countries. It's around 61% of the exports in the world. That has affected sub-Saharan Africa, and also feedstock. So maize and wheat are used for feedstock, and that affects also sub-Saharan Africa. So in terms of the food import bill for sub-Saharan Africa, yes, the cost of food has increased substantially in the world, but sub-Saharan Africa is one of the most vulnerable economies, is more where most of the food crisis countries are. So they are substantially affected. Just to give you an idea of the magnitude, on the 61 most vulnerable countries in the world, we are talking of an increase in the food import bill that is around $25.4 billion. So that's the additional cost to import the same amount of food for these 61 countries that they imported in the previous year.
Wow.
And this is touching 1.7 billion people. So it's a significant number of people vulnerable and countries which are vulnerable today. The other regions that are affected is, of course, any country which is net food importing country is affected. There are many countries that are part of this list. So we have countries in Asia. Of course, Afghanistan is affected. Democratic People's Republic of Korea. We have other countries that are in the Syrian Arab Republic, and many others. If we go to lower middle income, we will have many countries also outside of Africa, like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Timor-Leste, Tunisia, Sri Lanka. All of them has been affected. The important thing here is that the impact here is double. No, it's one impact because of the food import bill increase, and the second impact that is extremely relevant is because of the cost of fertilizers. And that is where we have a major concern today, because the cost of fertilizers has increased substantially. In some cases has quadrupled, in some cases has tripled. And that has put in a situation where many farmers in the world cannot afford fertilizers anymore. And that will be affecting the harvest of 2022, 2023, which is our major concern. So if you have to summarize the situation today we have a situation of food access problem. So too high prices, which makes more difficult for people to get the food they need. But potentially in 2022, 2023, we will have a problem not only of food access, but also a potential problem of food availability. Why? Because both Russian Federation and Ukraine, if they continue in war, they will significantly reduce their exports. Our projections right now is, under the current conditions, Ukraine will reduce in around 40% their exports of wheat and maize. And something similar could happen to Russia Federation because of the restrictions. And second, if the world keep exporting countries lower their yields and lower their supplies and the export surpluses because of lower use of fertilizers, that together will create a problem of food access also. So that is the critical situation which we have to avoid. And one last thing which is important is this year, for example, the supply of rice has been extremely good, a very good harvest. What we are observing now is that because of the increase in the cost of fertilizers, rice production is being affected for the next year, and prices of rice are starting to increase, which has been okay up to now. And that becomes extremely risky because, as I said before, it's a key staple around the world, but it's also a key staple for sub-Saharan Africa.
And you mentioned earlier that conflict was the biggest driver of food insecurity, and your research shows that it accounts for 72% of the dramatic increase since 2016. How do you make sure that countries in these situations have access to food?
Now, one thing that is important to understand and where we are pushing a solution, an immediate solution, is that of these countries that are in the most vulnerable situation and vulnerabilities because they are net food importers, but they are also countries that have balance of payment problem, we are proposing what we call the Food Import Financing Facility, which we hope the IMF will operationalize because that's consistent with the balance of payment mechanism financing facility that you have in the IMF. Why is this so critical? First, because you're touching 1.7 billion people here, and what you want to minimize is any potential risk of social unrest.
Yeah.
So these are countries that today could end in social unrest if they are not able to cover this gap of the food import bill. Because what we are observing in these countries is first, they are not importing what they need, which is problematic because many of them are inelastic with respect to these commodities. Second, some of them are importing things which are of a low calorie content and could create significant problems. And third is that they don't have capacity to access to the financial system because they are already too indebted. And then here I am referring to Afghanistan, Burkina Faso, Burundi, Central African Republic, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Gambia, Guinea, Liberia, Mali, Mozambique, Niger, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Somalia, South Sudan, Syria, Togo, Yemen. So all countries which are in a very tight situation, but what we need to avoid right now is this potential risk of social unrest. And that's where we believe this food import financing facility could help to support these countries immediately while things settle out in the world, and then they can repay later on this cost of this import gap, which is, as I mentioned before, $24.6 billion that they need to cover if you want to cover 100% of the increase in their food import bill.
So I'm just going to remind our listeners that our guest today is the chief economist for the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, Maximo Torero Cullen. So these crises obviously have economic and humanitarian aspects to them. And as the chief economist for one, if not the largest food and agriculture organizations in the world, how do you separate one from the other? Or can you separate the humanitarian needs from the economic challenges in these crises?
No, I think that they are tied together, no? Because what happens, and it's simple to look at it, most of the countries which are food crisis countries right now, which are in a humanitarian situation, most of these countries are also net food importers of these two countries, of Russian Federation and Ukraine. So they are also affected because of that, okay? In addition, of course, the spillover of the consequences of the increase in food prices is affecting countries which are not in food crisis, but which have very vulnerable people inside those countries, right, and which is also being at risk because of the increase of food prices. So for us, at the end of the line, what we try to do is, of course, there are locations where you have internal conflict that you have to go and give direct assistance to them. And that's what WFP does, what OSHA does. Mm-hmm. But also in many of these countries, you have to find other mechanisms to help them, no? And one way in an emergency situation is to provide them means so that they can keep producing, because that will give them at least self-consumption for a year, so that you don't have to be giving cash transfers directly to them to support them. And that's what we do in the more critical situations. But the major concern to us right now is, okay, in these 62 countries where you have a clear problem of capacity of covering the increase in the food import bill, what we can do today so that we can resolve that problem urgently. And that is basically this food import financing facility, which is a supplement to the balance of payments, so that they can use these increasing resources to help compensate so that they can import what they need this year, minimize the risk of social unrest, which could exacerbate even more the situation. Now, the other thing, and the way we look at this is, of course, there is the emergency, how we can cover this gap in financing for covering the food import bill, but we also need to focus, especially on the distribution of fertilizers. We need to focus that the key exporting countries are able to supply to the world what they used to supply. Yeah. So for us, it's really important that any mobility of fertilizers, any distribution of fertilizers and exports are towards those countries which could be producing at the levels that we need to have the export surpluses. Major concern right now is rice. So if I have to make a choice on allocation of fertilizers, the countries which are key exporters of rice will be a priority for us, because they are the ones that will supply the rice that we need in the world to minimize a food access problem in the next year. No? So that's where we need to make differences. What we need to understand is that in the input side, in the case of the fertilizers, what we are observing today is a shrink of the supply. Yeah. And the shrink of the supply is because of the export restrictions of Russian Federation, and also because of the increase in gas. And why gas? Because gas is the key input that is used in the technology to produce fertilizers, nitrogen, which is what is needed, and what Europe uses. And Europe is a key exporter of nitrogen. So if you have Russian Federation nitrogen out of the market, plus plants in Europe and in the UK, which are closing because of the increasing price of gas, you will have a shrink in the supply. That's what we are observing. Now, if I have a shrink in the supply, prices will go up. But if I start subsidizing fertilizers, the only thing I will do is shift the demand. So the prices will increase. And if I don't target properly, what will happen is I will increase inefficiencies. So that's something that we need to avoid unless I want to target very vulnerable people so that they can have subsistence and they can produce for a year. But in the overall context, we need to minimize those type of policies because we have a problem of supply. So the major measure is how we resolve the problem of supply. Now, the second element is, okay, we need to increase efficiencies also in the use of fertilizers. And that's where the soil maps could help enormously to increase the efficiencies so that we can reduce the waste, because normally countries are not using the proper blending of N, P, and K because they don't have detailed soil maps. And that can be deployed pretty quickly now with the new technologies. And third, we used to understand from science how other tools are there, what other fertilizer types, what other mechanisms are there that could allow us to find substitutes in the short term and in the medium term so that we can reduce also the dependency on NPK.
So that brings me right into my next question, which is about how countries are responding. Are there things that countries are doing that are perhaps making things worse? And I'm thinking here of export bans in particular.
Yes, and sure. And that's something that we need to try to avoid as much as possible. Look, if you look at the level of export restrictions and the impact in terms of the calories being traded, if we compare COVID-19 had a short period of time where the export restrictions in terms of traded calories was around 7%. And it took a few weeks and then it disappeared. If we look at the 2007-2008 food crisis, where we had significant level of export restrictions, the level of the calories being traded restricted were 16%. If we look at today, we have 17% of calories being traded restricted right now. More than 20 countries putting export restrictions.
Wow.
There has been a small improvement because of a palm oil exporter that removed the export restriction, but still the duration of the level of export restriction is now longer than what we have in 2007-2008. So imagine in this context that we start having problems with rice, which is a very thin market. Many countries will start to impose export restrictions in rice, and that will exacerbate even more the situation. So export restrictions, given the concentration that we have in the world of key exporting countries of these commodities, are extremely damaging. And a clear example of how removing it create a good result is that if you look at the food price index of FAO, the historical maximum was in March. Then there was a very small decline in April and a little bigger decline in May, but not in the cereal prices. But the overall index declined because of the removal of the export restriction in palm oil, which immediately reduced the price of oilseeds. And that helped that the overall index reduce a little bit, although it's still very high. So it's very important to share information to the world, and that's what our agricultural market information system does to minimize the presence of export restrictions of any type.
So another big driver here, as you said at the beginning of this interview, is climate change, of course. And given so much dependence on rain-fed agriculture in those regions where we're seeing this food crisis is looming, if not imminent, what would it take to help producers find alternative means to increase agricultural output in these hard-hit regions?
So climate change have two potential impacts. One is extreme situations like droughts or flooding. And the other one, which is extremely important, is variability. So if you are a person making a decision in a business and your price varies every day or every second, your temperature varies every day, you cannot make proper choices. And that creates a lot of inefficiencies. If you are a farmer and you get a drought, then of course you will lose your production. So what farmers have to do and how these farmers can be helped, not only because they are rain-fed, because if you look at the scenarios and simulate the scenarios with rain-fed countries and countries with irrigation, some cases, because of the climate change scenarios, even the irrigation ones are worse than they were before, okay? Because the areas where you are rain-fed, you have more water and you are doing better, and therefore your productivity will increase faster, no matter you have irrigation mechanisms. But the important thing here is what we can do with farmers to increase their resilience. No? One way, of course, is to insure them. And of course, in developed countries, the insurance for farming is extremely high and extremely subsidized. In poor countries, it's more difficult because you don't have the resources to create this level of subsidies. And also, you don't have all the necessary information and the frequency of information for the reinsurance companies to be able to calculate proper losses and therefore to reduce the prime of the insurance. So I think there is a lot of innovation that we need to do there with artificial intelligence and modeling tools to help reinsurance companies to lower their cost and to bring with innovative insurance mechanisms like combining weather index insurance with traditional mechanisms to reduce the risk, or with digital technologies and linking them also to loan mechanisms. Mexico is a good example. Mexico started to implement weather index insurance initially with significant subsidy. Now they do competitive process and companies compete, and the subsidy has basically reduced to a minimum. But they did a lot of effort in creating this mechanism in place so that they can support their farmers with this insurance, and they also link that to the financial system. So to be able to get a loan from the agrarian bank of the country or from a commercial bank, they will require that you have this insurance in place so that you minimize also the risk for the financial system. So that's one way you have to innovate. The second way is science and technology, trying to figure out what is the best science, what are the best varieties of seeds that are more weather resistant, advise the farmers what type of commodities they can plant so that they can resist extreme situations. And that's something that we need to move forward faster and trying to learn for what technologies are available. And the third one is linked to improving efficiencies, improving efficiencies in how we produce, how much food losses we have in the process and how we can minimize those so that we can have quicker and faster returns for farmers so that they can be able to cope with potential shocks in the future.
So we're obviously living a food crisis now. It's worse in certain parts of the world. But how do we prevent this from being a full-blown humanitarian disaster globally?
Yeah, that's extremely important. Look, right now, I wouldn't say we are in a food crisis right now. I think right now we have a food access problem, a very serious food access problem.
Okay.
If the things get worse, as I was predicting in terms of the yields for next year and the production for next year, when we have a food access and a food availability problem, then we will be in a very bad situation and what we could call a significant food crisis. I think right now we can do many things. The first thing that we are advising is, of course, on the humanitarian side, we need to continue supporting the humanitarian response to the most critical situation, but we need to link that also to provision of inputs and cash to maintain critical production systems and support the supply chains on those countries in deep emergencies, which includes people in Ukraine that they need to eat, so they need to have that support. But then for the whole system, I think the first step for us, which is extremely urgent, is to help the countries to cover the gap that they have in the food import bill. That's central, and that's where we believe the Global Food Import Facility, financing facility that we're proposing, will help and will be complementary to the current mechanisms. It's strictly based on urgent needs and limited to low and lower middle income countries, 62 countries, 1.7 billion people, and it could help in the future to increase resilience. Then we have to accelerate the process of efficiency gains. We need to keep trade open. That's central. As I mentioned before, the level of export restrictions we have right now is extremely risky, and it can exacerbate. We need to increase transparency of information. That's where the agricultural market information system has to be empowered. And then we need to increase efficiency in the use of fertilizers. Of course, first work to accelerate the mobility of fertilizers so that we can have enough fertilizers to avoid this problem of food availability in the next season. But also we need to take this as an opportunity to bring soil maps, reduce waste in the use of fertilizers, and become more efficient. And also we need to improve our targeting of the social protection programs that we have today. One of the challenges we found after COVID-19 was that countries like Brazil, for example, they were supporting and expanding their safety net, the cash transfer program that they have, to the same people that they were doing before. So last year, you will see that extreme poverty in Brazil went down because they increased the cash support to these people, but hunger went up. Yeah. And why is this happening? And this year, we are seeing a significant increase in hunger and on poverty. Why is this happening? Because many of these economies have a significant informal economy. And this informal economy was significantly affected by the lockdowns because they were for too long periods. And they dilute their working capital. And because they are informal, they don't have access to financial services. And these people were before middle-income people because they had significant income, although it was informal. But now they lost their working capital and they are moving into poverty and extreme poverty. That's why we are observing this significant increase on hunger despite the expansion on social protection. So the solution to minimize that problem is to identify where are the new hotspots of food insecurity. And our position is that we need to deploy the food insecurity experience scale that we developed and measure where the new hotspots of food insecurity are so that these social protection programs can be retargeted to be more effective and efficient under the current conditions.
Maximo Torero Cullen is the chief economist for the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization. Thank you so much.
A pleasure. Very nice talking to you.
Look for more about how the FAO is responding to the food access problem at FAO.org. The IMF is also working hard to help those countries most affected. Go to imf.org to find out more. And look for more IMF podcasts on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Subscribe and leave us a review if you like what you're hearing. You can also follow us on Twitter at IMF_podcast. I'm Bruce Edwards. Thanks for listening.